Good evening, everyone. Welcome to lecture 2 on organisms and population. So in the last lecture, we study what is ecology. So ecology is the branch of science that deals with the interactions of biotic components and the abiotic components. So we study that in the ecological hierarchy, it starts from the organism level, that which is the most simplest one, and reaches up to the biome level, which is the most complex one, and deal with the more complex interactions between the abiotic and biotic components. So in the last lecture, we study what are organisms. Organisms are the individuals that interact with the biological components and abiotic components that are present in their environment. Also, we study that organisms of these similar species that are present in a similar geographical area interact with each other to form the population. So, and they reside in a habitat. So, habitat of a population or an organism is decided by various abiotic factors. So, abiotic factors in an ecosystem are non-living elements of the environment, and these abiotic factors actually influences the way organisms and ecosystem function. As we see in the last lecture also, that depending on the various types of abiotic factors, depending on the conditions which are present in any environment, the habitat of an organism is defined. So the habitat of an organism or the ability of an organism to live in any environment depends upon its environmental conditions, which are defined not only by the biotic factors like the competitors or the predators, but also by the various abiotic factors. For example, the sunlight, temperature, soil, and water. So depending on the different abiotic conditions that are present in any ecosystem, the biotic components are also influenced by the abiotic factors. So now, in order to survive in any particular environment or in order to survive in an ecosystem, the biotic components that are present in that particular ecosystem has to interact with the abiotic factors. So a biotic component has some responses that it has generated towards the abiotic factors in order to survive well in that particular habitat or niche. So having realized that the abiotic conditions of many habitats may vary drastically in time, and we now know that how do the organisms living in such habitats cope or manage with stressful conditions. So the question is, how do these organisms that live in such habitats that may not be suitable for them cope or manage with such stressful conditions that are produced due to the abiotic factors in the environment? So one would expect that during the course of evolution or during the course of millions of years of their existence, species would have relatively evolved at a constant like they would have a constant internal temperature, and that permits all the biochemical reactions and physiological reactions to functions to proceed with maximal efficiency. For example, if we talk about the humans, so we humans have a constant body temperature of around 37 degrees centigrade, and most of our physiological functions or most of the biochemical reactions that occur in our body, most of the enzymatic reactions that occur in our body are optimum at this particular temperature, or they perform, or most of the biological functions are performed with the maximal efficiency at this particular temperature. So basically, this is what we expect from the other organisms as well, that during the course of evolution or during the millions years of existence, they would have acquired a constant body temperature, and this is the temperature at which most of the biochemical and physiological functions of that particular organisms occurs at a maximum efficiency, and therefore defining the overall fitness of the species. So this constancy, for example, could be in terms of optimal temperature or the osmotic concentration of the body fluids. Ideally, the organism, in order to survive well in that particular condition, try to maintain the constancy of its internal environment, and this process is known as the homeostasis. Despite the changes in the external environmental conditions, that may lead to the changes in the homeostatic conditions, the body tries to maintain its homeostasis. That is, a body or the organism tries to maintain the constancy of its internal environment by the process which is known as homeostasis. So basically, this may be in terms of optimal temperature. Either the body tries to maintain the optimal temperature or the osmotic concentration of the body fluids. So homeostasis is the process by which the body reacts to the changes in order to keep the condition inside the body, for example, temperature the same. So basically, homeostasis is the process by which we try to adapt or react to the changes in order to keep the conditions inside the body constant. For example, we know that we have a constant body temperature of 37 degrees centigrade, irrespective of our outer environmental temperature. For example, in summers, in the scorching heat, the temperature may rise up to 47 or 48 degrees centigrade. But our internal body temperature remains constant. So our body tries to maintain that internal body temperature constant to up to 37 degrees centigrade. And this actually happens by the process which is known as homeostasis, that actually maintains or resists the change in the body, in the internal environment of the body, to keep the conditions inside the body constant. So different organisms have different mechanism to keep their internal body temperature constant, and different organisms also have different ability to be able to maintain this homeostasis. So based on this, the organisms can be defined as regulators or conformers. So regulators are, as the name suggests, are the organisms that are able to maintain the homeostasis. They are able to regulate their homeostasis by physiological and sometimes behavioral changes that ensures the constant body temperature, constant osmotic condition, etc. So basically, the internal conditions of any organism is maintained, of such organisms are maintained by the process which is known as homeostasis, and these organisms try to maintain their constant body temperature, constant osmotic concentration of the body fluids, so that they can resist the change in the external environment. All birds, for example, and mammals, and a very few lower vertebrates and invertebrate species are indeed capable of such regulation. And this regulation is known as thermoregulation and osmoregulation. So thermoregulation, as the name suggests, is the uh, regulation of the body temperature, and osmoregulation is the regulation of the constant osmotic concentration in the environment, in the body. So this thermoregulation and osmoregulation is the process by which the organisms such as birds, mammals, and some lower vertebrates and invertebrates are able to maintain their constant body temperature and constant osmotic concentration. So these regulators therefore have the ability to maintain their body temp homeostasis irrespective of the changes in the external environment. So basically, evolutionarily, biologists believe that the success of mammals, why the mammals are very successful and they are successfully living on this planet Earth despite of such changes, is largely due to their ability to maintain a constant body temperature. Because this constant body temperature basically allows all the enzymes, all the biochemical reactions, all the physiological functions to occur at a maximum efficiency. Because in any organism, the biological functions or the physiological functions and biochemical reactions are tuned in a way that uh, they are performed by the organism at a at the maximum efficiency in a particular temperature range. So basically, since mammals have that ability to maintain a constant body temperature, therefore they are kind of very successful in the course of evolution. And we know that the mammals have the ability to thrive whether they live in Antarctica, which is very cold, and or in the Sahara Desert, which may be very hot. So Irrespective of the external temperature, changes in the external temperature, mammals have the ability to regulate. So mammals have the ability to regulate their body temperature, and therefore they can successfully live either in the cold conditions or in the hot scorching heat. So the mechanism used by most mammals to regulate their body temperature are very similar that we humans use. We know that we tries to maintain a constant body temperature of 37 degrees centigrade. So in summer, when we went outside, the temperature is more than our body temperature. For example, it may reach up to 40 degree or 45 degrees in the outside environment. So we have observed that we sweat profusely. This is because when we sweat, there is a release of liquid from our body, and due to the evaporation of that sweating, the resulting evaporation results in the cooling. So by this process, our body temperature remains constant to about 37 degrees centigrade. So this is what happens with the desert cooler in operation, brings down the body temperature. So basically, this sweating is a kind of um, strategy in humans to maintain the body temperature constant in case of summers. For example, if we look at the case of winters, so in winters when the temperature is much lower than 37 degrees centigrade, we start shivering. This is because the shivering produces heat and it raises the body temperature, thereby allowing the body temperature to be maintained to near around 37 degrees centigrade irrespective of the outer temperature. So this is how we humans and several other organisms maintain their body temperature during the summers and the winters. So in summers, as we see that by the process of sweating, we are able to cool down our body temperature due to the process of evaporation as well. And in winters, by the process of shivering, we shiver, and therefore our body produces heat and raises the body temperature. We are able to survive in that cold environment, and our body is able to maintain the temperature of about 37 degrees centigrade. While plants, on the other hand, do not have such mechanisms to maintain their internal temperatures, and therefore the process of thermoregulation in plants is not that efficient as we see in case of mammals. So, beside regulators, the other class of animals is conforms. So, conforms and like majority of the animals, like 99% of the animals and nearly all plants cannot maintain a constant internal environment. So, conforms are the organisms that do not have the ability to maintain their constant internal environment, and their body temperature changes with the ambient temperature. So their body temperature is mostly affected by the external environment. And in aquatic animals, the osmotic concentration of the body fluids change with that of the ambient water osmotic concentration. For example, if they are kept in a fresh water, or if they are kept in a salt water condition, then their body fluid, the osmotic concentration of the body fluid change with that of the ambient water osmotic concentration. These animals and plants are simply conformers, as they are not able to regulate their body temperature, or they are not able to regulate the maintain the homeostasis. So considering the benefits of constant internal environment to the organism, obvious question that we can ask is that how in the course of evolution these conformers have not evolved to become the regulators, because since they are able to uh, survive in such harsh conditions during the course of evolution, how these conformers are able to do that, and why they have not evolved to become the regulators. As because the obvious thing is that regulators are very successful, as they are able to maintain their body temperature and osmotic concentration, that is they are able to regulate their homeostasis. So why these conformers have not evolved to become regulators during the evolution? So we may recall the human analogy we used above. So how many people can really afford an air conditioner? Obviously a very few. So therefore we know that this is very like this requires a high amount of money. So similarly, the process to maintain a homeostasis or the process to maintain a constant internal environment is a very like is energetically very expensive for many organisms, and this process of thermoregulation is energetically highly expensive, and therefore all the organisms are not able to maintain their body temperature, as it requires a lot of energy to be consumed to maintain a constant internal environment. So since the thermoregulation is energetically expensive for any or for many organisms, therefore not all the organisms are able to maintain their constant internal environment, or not all the organisms are able to maintain the homeostasis. And especially this is true for small animals like shrews and hummingbirds. Heat loss or heat gain is a function of surface area. Now, we know that the small animals have a larger surface area relative to their volume. So their surface area to volume ratio is high, and therefore they tend to lose the body heat very fast when it is cold outside. Then they have to expend high amount of energy to generate body heat through metabolism, which is not possible, or which is very energy consuming process in case of small animals like shrews and hummingbirds. So since the surface area to volume ratio is high, therefore the heat which is dissipated into the environment, in case suppose the external environment is cold, therefore the heat dissipated in order to maintain that body temperature, or the heat dissipated into the environment is, it is very fast, and therefore a body has to expend a large amount of energy to generate the heat through the metabolism. So it has to be metabolically very high, so the metabolic rate should become very high, and therefore the process become energetically very unfavorable. So this is the main reason why very small animals are rarely found in polar regions, because we know that the polar regions are the regions where the temperature is quite low, and since in such environmental conditions, the smaller animals will face a large amount of body loss of body heat, and that too very fast, and the organisms are not able to maintain their body temperature or generate body heat through metabolism at such a high rate. Therefore the survival becomes difficult in such conditions. So during the course of evolution, the cost and benefits of maintaining a constant environment are taken into consideration, and the organisms which can afford that, uh, which have the benefit of maintaining a constant internal environment, becomes the regulators, and those which have to pay a high cost, energetically high cost, in order to maintain their constant internal environment, they become conformers, and they like these organisms are therefore not able to maintain their constant internal environment. Although there are some species that have evolved the ability to regulate, but only over a limited range of environmental conditions, beyond which they simply conform. So therefore they may be called as the partial regulators. So this is the diagrammatic response of organismic response, and how different organism responds to the external and internal levels. So how the internal levels are affected by the external level, this is shown in this diagram. So we can see that the red lines represent the regulators. So the red line from this we can depict, the red line here depicts the regulators, and we can see that with the changes in the external level, the internal level remains the constant. There is no change in the internal level. So this is basically the representation of the regulators. So we know that the regulators are the ones that are able to maintain their internal conditions irrespective of the external environmental conditions. So therefore, with the changes in the external level, there is no change in the internal level, or the internal body temperature or osmotic fluid concentrations of the organisms. So such graph represents the regulators. While if we look for the conformers, we can see that with the changes in the external level, there is a change in the internal level. So with the changes in the external environmental conditions, there are changes in the internal conditions. So such graph represents the conformers, which is represented here in the green line. And the blue line here represents the partial regulators, which are able to regulate to up to a particular changes in the external environment, but beyond that, they are not able to regulate the changes. So after that, they behave as a conformer. That is, with the changes in the external environment, there is a change in the internal environment as well. So this blue graph represents a partial regulator. So this may be asked based on the diagram which is present here. It may be asked that which of them represents the regulators, which is representing the conformer, and which of these are the partial regulators. So we can simply look the changes in the internal level due to the changes in the external level. So if the changes in the internal level remain constant irrespective of the external level, then these are definitely the regulators. If the internal level changes or is dependent linearly on the external level, we can say that these are the conformers, and the partial regulators are the one which for a certain for certain changes, they may behave as regulators, but beyond that range, they start behaving as conformers. Now, these are some of the permanent uh, phases which organism has to go, and these are some of the permanent conditions the organism can behave like that. The organism can be a regulator or a conformer. But now there are certain organisms that have to temporarily adjust in a particular situation, and these organisms, in order to adapt to that temporary situation, may either migrate to different areas where the conditions are favorable to them, or they may undergo certain changes like hibernation or estivation, where they may have winter sleep or summer sleep, where they can hide themselves from the external environment uh, in order so that they can escape the changes in the external environment. So migration is basically when the organisms move temporarily to the another uh, environment which is more to the to another environment which is more suitable for their survival. So the organisms can move a bit temporarily from the stressful habitat to a more hospitable area and return when stressful period is over. So it is just the temporary movement of the organism from a more stressed condition to a more hospitable area where the organism can live or survive. And once when the stress period is over, the organism can move back to their original habitat. Many animals, for example, we have seen that the birds migrate during the winters. They undertake the long distance migration to move to the more hospitable areas. And every winter, we have seen many birds migrating to India as well. And the famous Kaladio National Park in Bharatpur in Rajasthan hosts thousands of migratory birds that come from the Siberia and other extremely cold northern regions. So in order to find a favorable environment, in order to find a favorable situation where the organism, where these birds can live for a particular period of time, these birds, especially during the winters, migrate from the uh, ex- uh, extremely cold northern regions, for example, Siberia to India. They migrate during these cold times where they can survive easily. And once when this stressful period is over, these birds move back to their original place. The other way is to, instead of migrate, some organisms suspend their biological activities. For example, we have seen that in bacteria, fungi, and lower plants, various kind of thick-walled spores are formed which help them to survive unfavorable conditions. So during unfavorable conditions, when the temperature is high, or we can say when the conditions in the external environment are unfavorable, these organisms like bacteria, fungi, and lower plants develop thick-walled spores around them, And various thick-walled spores are formed by these organisms during the unfavorable conditions. Uh, and during the formation of these thick-walled spores, the spores have very limited metabolic activity, and all of the activities are suspended. It requires very less energy in order to remain alive. And once the favorable conditions arrive, these spores germinate and these spores germinate and may take a normal shape. So these spores germinate on availability of suitable environment in case of bacteria, fungi, or lower plants. In higher plants, seeds and some other vegetative reproductive structures serve means to tide over periods of stress. Besides helping in dispersal, they germinate to form new plants under favorable moisture and temperature conditions. They do so by reducing their metabolic activity, and this state is known as the dormancy state. So these seeds become dormant and do not germinate until they find a suitable environment. They find a favorable moisture and temperature condition that allows them to germinate. So until this state, they remain in a dormant state. So basically, these seeds become dormant and they will germinate only when they will have a favorable moisture and temperature conditions. So this is how these bacteria, fungi, lower plants and higher plants suspend all the activities that are taking place for a particular period of time. And once the conditions are favorable, these bacteria, fungi, lower plants that are forming these spores or the seeds that become dormant starts germinating and form the actual organism. In animals, the organisms, if unable to migrate, might avoid stress by escaping in time. So, since animals are able to move, so they have one special feature that they can migrate. But there are certain animals that are unable to migrate, and therefore, in order to avoid the stressful condition, they escape in time. That is, they avoid the stressful condition by avoiding that uh, uh, either the very high temperature or very cold temperature. So this happens by the process which is known as hibernation, estivation, or diapause. So the familiar case of bears, we know that these bears go into the hibernation during winter, and this is an example of escape in time. So basically, this is known as a winter sleep, where the bear hide themselves in an environment that provides them the sufficient heat that allows them to escape the external cold conditions. And therefore, by remaining in that particular environment for that particular period of time till the winter season, this organism is able to survive, or this organism is able to remain in an alive state by escaping in time. Some snails and fish go into the estivation to avoid summer-related problems, heat and desiccation. So these organisms may form uh, dig a burrow, and they may remain inside that burrow, and therefore they may escape the scorching heat out in the outside environment, and they may avoid summer-related problems like heat and desiccation. So this is known as the summer sleep, where some snails and fish may undergo estivation. Under unfavorable conditions, many zooplankton species in lakes and ponds are known to enter diapause, a stage of suspended development. So basically, some organisms like zooplanktons may enter in a stage of diapause. Diapause is a stage of suspended development where the metabolic activity is halt and the development of the organism suspended. Since the development requires energy, and in order to avoid that consumption of high amount of energy, these organisms avoid that stage, and they suspend their development for a particular period of time, which is known as a diapause. So the organisms therefore can, uh, in order to survive, may either, if they are not able to regulate their body temperature, they may migrate to some suitable condition, suitable favorable places that allows them to survive normally in their normally The organisms may migrate, or they may escape in time by performing hibernation, estivation, or diapause, or they may suspend their metabolic activities. So, while considering the various alternatives available to the organisms for coping with extremes in their environment, some organisms are able to respond through certain physiological adjustment, while others do this by bringing the behavioral changes. So they migrate temporarily to a less stressful habitat. These responses are actually their adaptations. So adaptation is any attribute of the organism that may be morphological, physiological, behavioral that enables the organism to survive and reproduce in its habitat. So some organisms cope these extremes in the environment by physiological mechanisms, some by behavioral mechanism, and some by morphological mechanisms. So such attributes that allow the organism to survive and reproduce in its habitat is known as the adaptation. And many adaptations have evolved over a long evolutionary time, and now these adaptations are genetically fixed. For example, we may see that the morphology of the desert plants is different from the morphology of the ones that are present in the polar regions. So this is, and these changes or these adaptations have evolved over a long period of time, and now these are genetically fixed in that particular plant species. So these are some of the examples of adaptations that I will read one by one. So in the absence of external source of water, kangaroo rat in North America deserts is capable of meeting all its water requirement through its internal fat oxidation. So it is known, or it is a common saying, that kangaroo rat do not drink water. So how does it survive? So basically it is able to do so by doing internal fat oxidation, of which the water is a byproduct. So by performing the internal fat oxidation, water is produced as a byproduct, and basically by doing so, by carrying out the internal fat oxidation, it meets its water requirements. Also, we know that urine is a source through which most of the water is excreted out of a body. So it also has the ability to concentrate its urine so that minimal volume of water is used to remove the excretory products. So this is how it is adapted to an environment where there is a very less water available, or there is a scarcity of water. So by doing the internal fat oxidation, in which the water is formed as a byproduct, it is able to meet its water requirement. Also by allowing the by preventing the loss of water by concentrating its urine, it has the ability to minimize the volume of water that is used to remove the excretory products out of the body. Similarly, many desert plants have a thick cuticle on their leaf surfaces and have their stomata arranged in the deep pits. We know that in deserts the temperature is high, so therefore the rate of evaporation must also be high. So therefore, many desert plants have developed a thick cuticle on their leaf surface. This thick cuticle allows the less rate. These leaf surfaces have their stomata. Like the stomata is not present on their surface, but is situated deep into the leaves, and therefore it allows the minimal loss of water through the process which is known as transpiration. So we know that transpiration is a process in plants where the water loss happens through the leaf surface through the stomata. So these adaptations have allowed the minimal loss of water through the transpiration. Also, these plants have a special photosynthetic pathway, which is known as the CAM pathway, and that enables the stomata to remain closed during the daytime. So by doing so, since the temperature during the daytime is quite high, so by closing their stomata during the daytime, these organisms or these desert plants are able to minimize the loss of the water. Similarly, other desert plants like Apontia have no leaves, so thereby preventing the loss of water through transpiration. and these leaves have actually reduced to the spines, and the photosynthetic function which is performed by the leaves is basically taken over by the flattened stems, which are green in color, that contains the chlorophyll and therefore can carry out the photosynthesis. So in plants such as Opuntia, the leaves are reduced to spines. Spines, we know that the surface area is very less, so the rate of evaporation must be very low. So, and the photosynthetic function is taken by the flattened stems. Also, we know that, for example, in case of plants that are present in water, these plants, the leaves of these plants have a waxy surface that does not allow the water to retain on the leaves and thereby preventing the closure of the stomata and also thereby preventing the submerge of that plant into the water. So this is how different plants or different animals have actually adapted to different environmental conditions, and therefore they have undergone some morphological, physiological or behavioral changes that enables the organism to survive and reproduce in its habitat. Now there is another thing that the mammals from the colder climates generally have shorter ears and limbs so that they can minimize the heat loss. So this was given by the Allen, and this is known as the Allen's rule, that suggests that if we look into the mammals from the colder climates, we will find that these have shorter ears and limbs so that due to the decrease in the surface area, the heat loss is minimal. Bergman also gives a similar kind of rule that states that the organism at higher altitudes should be larger and thicker than those closer to the equator to better conserve the heat. And Allen's rule states that they will have shorter and thicker limbs at higher altitudes. So basically, if we combine both the rules, we will find that the organisms that are living at higher altitudes are larger, thicker, with shorter limbs and thicker limbs, so that most of the heat can be conserved and there is a minimal loss of heat. And while the organisms that remain closer to the equator, they have comparatively large, they are comparatively smaller and they have comparatively larger limbs. So in the polar seas, aquatic mammals like seals, they have a thick layer of fat which is known as sea blubber below their skin that act as an insulator and reduce the loss of body heat. We have also seen that in polar bear we have brown fat that actually prevents the loss of the body heat and act as an insulator, reducing the loss of body heat. Some organisms possess adaptations that are physiological, which allow them to respond quickly to a stressful condition. In most animals, the metabolic reactions and hence all the physiological functions proceed optimally in a narrow temperature range. For example, in humans, it is 37 degrees centigrade. But there are microbes, archaebacteria, that flourish in the hot springs and deep sea thermal vents where temperature far exceeds the 100 degrees centigrade. So this is so these organisms, like for example the animals, for example these archaebacteria or the bacteria that flourish in the hot springs and deep sea hydrothermal vents, are able to survive in the temperature that exceeds the 100 degree centigrade. So they have undergone some physiological changes, or their physiological functions are like these organisms have the ability to perform the physiological functions at such a high temperature. Many fish thrives in Antarctic waters where the temperature is sub-zero or below the zero and below zero. A large variety of marine vertebrates and fish live at great depths in the ocean where the pressure could be more than 100 times the normal atmospheric pressure that we experience. So these organisms have acquired some physiological changes due to which they can they are able to survive at such a low or high temperature or under such a high pressure. So organisms in such that lives in such extreme environments also show a variety of biochemical adaptations, and some organisms show behavioral responses to cope with variations in the environment. For example, desert lizards lack their physiological ability that mammals have to deal with the high temperatures of their habitat, but manage to keep their body temperature fairly constant by behavioral means. So basically, how these desert lizards do so? So they bask in the sun and absorb heat when their body temperature drops below the comfort zone. But when the temperatures start increasing, they move into the shade. So this is the physiological ability that these organisms do not have, but still due to some behavioral responses, these organisms are able to cope with the variations in the environment. So these organisms lack the physiological abilities just like that the mammals have, but still are able to survive in the environment by having some behavioral responses like if their body temperature decreases below the comfort zone, they may simply bask in the sun, and if their body temperature is high, they may move into the shade. So if the ambient temperature start increasing, they may move into the shade. Some species are capable of burrowing into the soil to hide and escape from the above ground heat. So when the temperature is quite high, these organisms simply move into their burrow and reside there until the temperature becomes favorable for them. So this was all about the organisms, how different organisms behave in different environmental conditions, how do these organisms adapt to different environmental conditions, are these organisms able to regulate their body temperature, or are these organisms not able to regulate their body temperature? This was all about the organisms and the behavior at the behavioral, physiological, or metabolic response at the individual level. The next step in the ecological hierarchy is the population. So we know that individuals of same species that live in groups in a well-defined geographical area that shares or compete for similar resources that can potentially inbreed constitute a population. So the organisms that live in a particular individuals of the same species that live in a particular area in a particular geographical area that compete for the same interest that requires a similar kind of resources that can inbreed are known as the population. Although the term interbreeding has been used here, so interbreeding is usually implied for the sexual reproduction, but a group of individuals resulting from even asexual reproduction is also generally considered a population for the purpose of ecological study. So we may consider it as bacterial population also for ecological study. So organism at the individual level has to cope with a changed environment. But natural selection operates at the population level to evolve their desired traits. So therefore, studying the population ecology is important as this is the area of ecology because it that links the ecology to population genetics and evolution. Because as we see that organisms are at the individual level and they have the like whenever we are studying the organism or the whenever we are trying to study the organism, we are studying the ecology at the individual level. But the natural selection do not uh, operates at the individual level or at the level of organism. It actually operates at the population level to evolve the desired traits. Therefore, it is an important area in ecology that links the ecology to population genetics and evolution. Now, there are certain attributes or the properties of a population that defines a particular population. So a population has certain attributes that an individual organism do not. So an individual organism can have a birth, can have a death. But if we talk about the population, we have a birth rate and death rate. So in a population, these rates refer to the per capita birth and death respectively. And the rates therefore expressed is change in numbers, increase in case of birth or decrease in case of death with respect to members of the population. So basically it is not the birth or the death that we talk about in the population. Instead we talk about the birth rate, that is the increase in the number with respect to the members of the population, or death rate, that is the decrease in the number with respect to the members of the population. So for example, if in a pond there are 20 lotus plants last year and through reproduction 8 new plants are added, taking the current population to 28, we calculate the birth rate as 8 divided by 20, that is 0.4 offsprings per lotus per year. So this is the birth rate. Similarly, if 4 individuals in a laboratory population of 40 fruit flies died during a specified time interval, say a week, the death rate in a population during that period is 4 divided by 40, that is 0.1 individuals per fruit fly per week. So this is how we define the birth rate and the death rate, and this is how we calculate the birth rate and the death rate in any population for a particular period of time. Per individual and per individual for a particular period of time. So besides this, we have another attribute characteristic of a population, which is the sex ratio. As the name suggests, it is individual can either be a male or a female, but a population has a sex ratio. That is the ratio of females to males. So, example, 60% of the populations are females and 40% males. So, this is how we define a sex ratio in any given population. But we do not define the population by male or female, but we define the population by an attribute which is known as the sex ratio. A population at any given time is composed of individuals of different ages, and if the age distribution percentage individuals of a given age or age group is plotted for the population, the resulting structure is called an age pyramid. So basically, similarly, an individual has a particular age, but in a population that is composed of different individuals, certainly different ages must be present. So if the age distribution, that is the percentage individuals of a given age or group, is plotted for the population, the resulting structure will be the age pyramid. So this figure represents the age pyramids for human population, and these may be expanded, stable, declining. So the shape of the pyramid basically reflects the growth of the population, whether it is growing, stable, or it is declining. So these figures represents different age pyramids, where we can see that the different groups, that is pre-reproductive, reproductive, and post-reproductive, are present, and they are plotted depending on the number of reproductive individuals that are present, reproductive individuals that are present in any population, and the post-reproductive population. And these individuals that form a group of pre-reproductive, reproductive, and post-reproductive helped in defining the various characteristics of the population that reflects the growth status of the population. So it may be either expanding, whether it might be growing, it may be stable, or it may be declining. So we will study each of these age pyramids one by one. So the first one is the expansive pyramid, which is expanding. So these type of pyramids have a much larger population of pre-reproductive and reproductive age groups, and the population of post-reproductive age group is very less compared to pre-reproductive and post-reproductive and reproductive. And these type of pyramids are usually seen in developing countries. Here in these countries, the fertility rate is usually high, but life expectancy is very less. Therefore, the post-reproductive individuals are less as compared to the reproductive and pre-reproductive. So the base of the pyramid is wide and tapers towards the top with a triangular shape. So the base is wide and it tapers on the top, giving it a triangular shape. It is very important to remember that developing countries have such kind of expansive pyramid. The next is the stationary population pyramid. So as the name suggests, the stationary population pyramids have almost an equal population in each group. And these type of pyramids are seen in developing countries. That's why the name stationary means the birth and the death rates are equal and the population is neither increasing or decreasing. There are usually not any major changes in the mortality rate and the fertility rates, and the shape of this pyramid is bell-shaped. The next is constructive population pyramid. So as the name suggests, the population is decreasing here. Constructive, as the name suggests, the population is decreasing. These type of pyramids show declining birth rates, low fertility low fertility rates and higher life expectancy. So we can see that the pre-reproductive individuals are less than the reproductive and post-reproductive individuals. And the fertility rate is basically low and life expectancy is high, mortality is very low, therefore post-reproductive individuals are high in such cases. These graphs are narrow at the base and show the decreasing size of the population and they are unshaped. Here the post-reproductive and elderly population is more than the pre-reproductive and the reproductive population. Now what are the advantages or what are the uses of reading a population pyramid? So there are various uses of population pyramid. Firstly, it tells about the composition of the population of any particular area, that whether the population is comprised mostly of the reproductive or post-reproductive individuals, what is the composition of population in any particular area. It also tells the number of dependent individuals. So in most of the cases, the pre-reproductive individuals and post-reproductive individuals are dependent on the young population in any area. So therefore, depending on this population pyramid, we can tell about the number of dependent individuals that are children and elderly people in any area. Also, it tells about the age differences in sexes of any given area. It also tells about the mortality rate and fertility rate. So in pyramids where the post-reproductive individuals are less as compared to the pre-reproductive and reproductive individuals, we can say that the mortality rate is higher as compared to fertility rate. While if we see there are certain pyramids where like for example, constructive pyramids, the fertility rate is lower and the the mortality rate is lower and the fertility rate is also low. So these have low fertility rates and low mortality rates. These are also used to find on the future growth of the population, that if a particular population is expanding or it is constricting, so it is helpful in order to determine the future growth of the population. The next attribute of a population is a population size. The size of the population tells us a lot about the status in the habitat. Size in nature could be as low as 10 or it may go into millions. The population size, it's better to call it as a population density, which is designated as N. And it is not necessarily that we always measure the population in terms of these numbers only. For example, in some cases, the percentage cover or biomass is more meaningful than the measure of the population size. Is more meaningful measure of the population size as compared to the number. For example, if there is a park where a large old banyan tree is present and very small other plants are present, we can see that in such cases, the percentage cover or the biomass of that single individual plant is higher as compared to the other smaller plants that are present in the vicinity. So in that cases, the percentage cover or biomass is a more meaningful measure of the population size as compared to the number. Also, total number is again not an easily adoptable measure if the population is huge and the counting is impossible and time consuming, for example, in case of bacteria. Sometimes for certain ecological investigations, there is no need to know the absolute population densities. And in such cases, we actually go for the term which is known as the relative densities. And this relative density of the population serves the purpose equally well. So basically, from this, we can understand that in order to understand the size of the population, which tells us about the status in the habitat, it is not necessary that we always count it in the form of numbers. We can also understand the population size by the percentage cover or biomass, or we may also have the relative densities instead of the population density that might serve our purpose. So ecological effects of any factors on a population are generally reflected in its size, which is the population density. And this may be expressed in different ways: numbers, biomass, percentage cover, etc., depending on the species. So this was all about the population size, and these are the various basically attributes like the birth rate, mortality rate, fertility rate, and death rates. Basically, these are the different attributes that define a population. And in the next class, we will learn about the population growth. There are various models that are available to understand the different population growth models, that how a different like how different organisms or the how different population grow, and there are various models that are developed to understand the population growth, and these are known as the population growth model. So basically, in the next class, we will learn about the population growth models, and how these organisms which are present in any population are interdependent on each other and on the other organisms. So what are the different kinds of interactions that may take place in the organisms within the population? We will study such parameters, and we will study such interactions in the next section. For this session, it was about the population size. It was about different attributes of the population, and how different organisms adapt to a particular environmental condition. Either they may migrate, they may suspend their activities, or they have the ability to regulate their body temperature, that is regulators, or they might not be able to regulate their temperature, that are conformers, and they might be partial regulators. So this was all about today's lecture. And in the next lecture, we will learn more about the population and the population growth models. With this, I would like to end today's session. Thank you all for attending. Thanks a lot.